showcasing their work and showcasing work that is so wonderful. So welcome, Mihir.
Thank you so much. And it's kind of like a homecoming because the book is on Jharkhand. I am here in Jharkhand and among my people, so it's a very special day personally as an author when the book comes home.
So is this your first session in Jharkhand on the book?
Yes.
Okay, so
First in
actually,
a literature festival.
okay. So, as you said, it's a homecoming for the book, but the book is about a homecoming for you. And it's an intersection of being a very personal diary of a certain time in your life and an exploration of a landscape that you grew up in, but in many ways you were rediscovering. So it would be very glib to say it's a metaphor at some level, but I think you honestly are archiving and you're honestly introspecting. So two things happen in the book, and one of the people in the blurb, Shumona Roy, has said it's somewhere between archive and experience. So this is, you're a poet. So what made this book come to be?
So for the longest time there was this idea uh, and it was a felt idea. It wasn't a scholarly idea. It was a felt idea that my hometown or my homeland, as I call it, Hazaribagh is beautiful. But what was missing was the articulation of that idea in contemporary times. So I could feel certain things that yes, the hills are beautiful, the rivers are beautiful, and all of these places are beautiful. But then why is no one talking about this beauty? So I would sometimes turn to the depiction of Jharkhand, and what I would find instead was gangs of Wasepur, Jamtada, and these kinds of very, darkly dark portrayals of the state, which kind of invisibilize that there's a richness to the landform here. Chota Nagpur Plateau is perhaps one of the oldest land masses in India, and 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 so few things have been written about it. So for the longest time, I used to consider that why is it that we think of only Himalayas or the beaches as beautiful, but not what is in front of us. And then when I started growing up, and when I reached that stage where there came a point in my life where I needed this particular kind of landscape as a shelter. But that shelter was also not, so to say, solipsistic. It wasn't like, I want this, so you come to me. But that wanting was also a bit textured in the way that I wanted not only this landscape, but the history of the landscape. Not only the good things, but also the ugly things. Not only the waterfalls, but also the coal dust and all of these things. What I was trying to create was to give a poetic expression to these very conflicting kinds of emotions that I used to feel. And that perhaps created a kind of, empirical knowledge with things that happened to me, and also a scholarly type of knowledge, things that I found out by reading old records, old literature. And in those records and literature, I found my grounding. So that those
Was it
things.
hard? Because as you mentioned, not much is written. There is not that many books one finds. I could personally say that when I'm curating this festival, if I'm trying to get voices from outside, there are very few one comes across. So
It,
how
it,
hard
it,
was it?
it was quite hard because growing up, no one taught us the history of Jharkhand. In our history books, we were like Chalukyas and the Mughals and all of these things. And even to think of this literary camaraderie that you can have with people who are writing about the same kind of things that you feel inclined towards, even that was very few. But what happened, where I found the most written material, was during the colonial period, because those officers used to really note everything down to the minute detail. And there I found a grounding that whatever I was feeling, it wasn't just in my head, but there was a history of articulation of this beauty, which curiously went missing in the 70s, 80s, 90s, so that when I would turn back to the immediate past, I would find nothing. at least not in English. So to to kind of excavate all those resources, some led me to London, some led me to the darkest alleys of Google, but I'm very glad that such excavation took place.
So, talking about Hazaribagh, you know, you've pointed out lots of unique things about it. It was supposed to be a sanatorium, and it is seen, especially among people from Bengal, as a place which is restorative, rejuvenative, and it's a place where people recuperate after illnesses. So, it has the reputation of all of this without ever having had a physical sanatorium.
Yes.
Similarly, it's considered to be a hill station when it is actually a plateau. So there are lots of misnomers, and you know, it's a place that eludes what it was supposed to be, and yet has certain things which we don't see in it. So how did you go about mapping these elisions as well as these facts in the place where, as you were writing the book?
And this idea of hill station, that's not only limited to Hazaribagh, but even Netarhat is considered hill station, which is in effect a higher plateau.
It's harder to say plateau station.
Yes, yes, because that vocabulary doesn't exist. So perhaps here empiricism played a larger part to actually venture out into the terrain and then to try and decode that what the terrain is telling you, instead of bringing from outside a certain set of words or phrases which you could attribute to that geography. So, for example, when someone is traveling on GT Road towards Calcutta, there is the Parasnath mountain which appears, and on the opposite side of the Parasnath mountain appear a long, loose form of a landmass which looks like hills. But those hills are actually the escarpment of the plateau. So if someone is merely looking, then the visual will return to them the appearance of hills, and they'll be right in saying that these are hills. But unless you actually go up the hill and you realize that, oh, it has become extremely flat, and then only you realize that, okay, we are in the plateau. So in order to debunk multiple of these myths, Hazaribagh being a hill station when it is a plateau town, in order to understand that where waterfalls might appear on such a terrain, it was very much required that the act of walking or deep travel, that should happen, unless we would be, or even I would be operating within the same set of words and phrases that were handed down to me through generations.
So there's also the thing that it was, you call it a national park rather unconsciously, but it is not a national park. It never really became one of the national parks. So moving on from there, your fascination for, you know, this is a bit of an Oscar type question. How much did your mother's love for nature and the way, even later when you were doing these excursions in your little alto, we must speak on the sidelines on how you should get a Maruti sponsorship or fellowship for your book, because the word alto and your travels have, I mean, forget the Mahindra Thar. This is the car to go around the country looking for waterfalls in. So how much did your mother's influence, Mate as you call her, you know, contribute to this curiosity? It's not just, we all use the love for nature very glibly, but there's also a curiosity and you feel almost a commitment to mapping this whole area. So how much did your childhood and her influence and love for travel influence you?
So I'll give you one example. When I was around 12 or 13 years of age, my mother, I, and my cousin, the three of us, we went to Pachmadhi in Madhya Pradesh. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And so in Panchmadhi, there was this stretch of river which the people there used to call Apsara Vihar. And we were walking down Apsara Vihar, and the guide said that, वो देखिए वहाँ पर जो चट्टान है वहाँ से करीना कपूर छलांग लगाई थी अशोका फिल्म में, right? So so that was the kind of the lure of that place, कि Bollywood movie की shooting हुई है यहाँ पर, which lends Apsara Vihar the credibility of beauty. हमने वो सारी चीजें देखी. We looked at the river, we looked at the streams, we looked at the jungle and everything. And when we were returning, My mother very wryly remarked कि ये अप्सरा भी आ रहा है, ऐसे तो हजार हैं हमारे झारखंड में. No, the issue then is it's not about the occurrences of these Apsara Vihars. It's about the articulation of these Apsara Vihars. So we may have had plenty of Apsara Vihars in Jharkhand. Abhi bhi 10 kilometer agar one goes from Ranchi, I'm sure that you'll find a jungle stream somewhere. But it's just that we never thought of attributing a sense of beauty to those jungle streams. This was a very intellectual kind of learning which my mother taught me. And then, of course, there is the so-called love of nature. So even when I was little, and Jharkhand at that time was reeling under the left-wing insurgency, plenty of forest areas were strictly no-go zones. And still my mother and I, we would hire jeeps or cars when Alto wasn't around. And we would still go and just explore. Mother will say that पता है यहाँ पर सुनने में आया है कि कुछ वो है, गर्म पानी का जगह है, so चलो चल के देखते हैं. So we would go to Suraj Kund and touch the water and experience for ourselves. And at the same time, Mate and I would also kind of wonder that why is it that it seems that only two of us are traveling? Why aren't many people traveling? Why do these places not elicit that wonder, that sense of awe among others? हम लोग दूसरों से बात करते थे and they would say कि हाँ कोई बात नहीं पटना जाएंगे. So for many people the idea of tourism was located either in bigger cities or in well-known tourist spots. But what Jharkhand does is that it's somewhere in the middle. It's not touristy, so it gives you the freedom to roam. And Mate and I, we would roam very nicely. We would go to कोई भी मंदिर अगर नया बना है तो वहाँ चले गए. उसके पीछे से अगर कोई stream बह रही है तो वहाँ जाकर बैठ गए. Just looking at the sal trees, which are kind of a motive for Jharkhand. So from there, this how do you say, this conditioning to look at the landscape through an appreciative lens. So that I got from mother as well, that intellectual as well as the emotional sense of rootedness.
So I think this is a good time for you to do the reading about how we are conditioned to
Yes.
expect certain forms of beauty and define it as scenic beauty.
I'll manage. So what I'm going to read is an extract from chapter 5. It's called North. So north of Hazaribagh town. And it's a short section. And whatever we just talked about, it's condensed here. The north of the plateau is a broken, often disappointing and surprising escarpment. It is seldom sheer and therefore not always impressive. It is less a dramatic elevation and more a series of bumpy, shoddy speed breakers found on Indian roads. To look for beauty in the north is to either renegotiate the concept or to subject the place to the existing codes of aesthetics. In some places, the rules of what we call natural beauty are well defined, like in the mountains or with the ocean. An articulation of beauty exists for such geographies. There is so much literature about them in books, images, videos, blogs, listicles. 10 things you must do in the Himalayas, 20 things to do in Kerala, or do you know about this hidden beach in Karnataka? Cliffs are beautiful, valleys are beautiful, waterfalls are beautiful, forests are beautiful, sunrise and sunset are beautiful, beaches are beautiful, seashells are beautiful, the gulls are beautiful, and the boats moored in azure waters are beautiful. To be beautiful is to be perceived as such. It is to believe in the narrative of beauty, if not the phenomenon itself. The plateau is beautiful as long as it shadows mountains in the escarpment, like the hills we talked about. It is beautiful as long as the rivers are tumbling. It is beautiful in its forests. It is beautiful in its isolated hills. With few frameworks to understand the beauty of a plateau, I borrow. The charm of my hills is borrowed. The attraction of my waterfalls is borrowed. The silence of my forest is borrowed too. The mind finds in these tropes ways to hinge a landscape for examination. To think that beauty could have rules, that land could be made to yield, imagine our vanity in such desires. When I am in the north, I am at my most selfish. I hoard my expectations, knowing that they will not be met. I make unreasonable demands, knowing that they won't be fulfilled. I make disappointment a norm, and I codify this disappointment into an aesthetic. Often the plateau disappoints, and in that alone lies its beauty. Thank you, thank you.
So while on beauty, you mentioned that the 70s, the 80s, there's a kind of a silence as far as any writings about this region is concerned. But it was also the time of that dreaded form of government intervention called Sundarikaran. So beautification is not really the biggest game the government has, and that is saying not much. So can you talk us through your phobia for Sundarikaran and what it does to your beloved plateau?
Yes, yes. I'm quite skeptic of this term Sundarikaran, beautification, all of these fancy sounding cliches that administration throws at us sometimes.
The other beautiful one is Thekedar Bhag Gaya.
And the reason why I feel anti-beautification is just like what we were talking about, that Jharkhand occupies that very, for some it would be in a negative way, but I think that it is Jharkhand's most positive attribute, that it is not a tourist destination, it is a dwelling place. So here, if there are natural sites, those natural sites, of course, some of them have been turned into tourist destinations. But there's a difference between a natural place and a tourist place. That's why these two terms are separate. The more we turn natural places into tourist places, the more I think formulaic we make our experience of nature. So, for example, if in the name of Sundarikaran, some infrastructural activity is done at a lake or a waterfall, then yes, on one level it is going to increase the footfall, thereby increasing the carbon footprint into the forest, which was earlier untouched. And while increasing the carbon footprint, what it is also going to do is that just by way of people following a marked trail or a marked bridge or a marked street, all experiences are now at risk of being uniform. You know, so the photos that we are going to take from a particular gazebo of a waterfall, 10 people are going to take the same kind of photo. So here what is happening is that in the name of Sundarikaran or beautification, what we end up encouraging is consumption of nature, not so much dwelling in nature. Jharkhand, being a young state, has that opportunity to emerge as a dwelling space for poets, writers, for sympathetic people who want to spend some private time with nature. The privacy with nature is so important to us that even if we go to the most crowded of natural places, Manali gaye, Shimla gaye, kahin bhi gaye, वहाँ पर अगर हम फोटो ले रहे हैं अपना, तो we purposefully blur out पीछे का crowd, so that when we are uploading photos on social media, वो मनाली हो, शिमला हो, या फिर बहुत नैनीताल जैसी भीड़ भाड़ वाली जगह हो, लेकिन उस फोटो में जो हम फेसबुक या इंस्टाग्राम पर डालते हैं, उस फोटो में मैं और नैनी झील, उस फोटो में मैं और ये पहाड़, मैं और ये झरना, और वो बाकी the rest of humanity which is there as a crowd, it doesn't exist. So the need, there is always a need in human being to spend some private quality time with nature without interference from others. Beautification kinds of make that possible. कि यहाँ पर एक डेस्टिनेशन हमने बना दिया, तो अब सारे लोग वहाँ पर आ गए, और उससे पहले the dwellers who used to call such places their dwelling spaces, वो alienate हो जाते हैं. एक waterfall अगर मैं जाता हूँ और मुझे बहुत पसंद है, and I like that place just for the way it is, right? So it's a much richer interaction that I am having with the waterfall. उसमें मैं गिरूं, पलटूं, चोट लगे, वो सब मेरे एक्सपीरियंस का हिस्सा है.
He keeps falling through the book.
यस वो सब एक्सपीरियंस का हिस्सा है और वो सारे जाकर एक टेक्सचर्ड एक्सपीरियंस बनाते हैं. बट अगर कल जाकर उस वाटरफॉल पर वो ट्रेल्स बन गए और बगल में गुलाब की फूल के क्यारी बन गई और सारी चीज़ें बन गई, तो नॉट ओनली आर वी पुटिंग द विल्डरनेस इटसेल्फ एट रिस्क, बट वी आर ऑल्सो, फिर आगे जाके क्या होगा कि मैं उससे कनेक्ट नहीं कर पाता. सो वाइल यू कैन open a place up for tourists, but you will lose me, then I won't be the person going to those places. So that's why I don't, and beautification always happens at places that are already beautiful. So पहले से जो सुंदर जगह हैं वहाँ पर जाकर हम सुंदरीकरण कर रहे हैं, which makes no sense. It's tautology. So and logically also I don't find it appealing, and in larger philosophical way which I described, उसमें भी I think that it has more demerits than merits.
So the well-meaning but muddle-headed beautification is on one side. The other thing that concerns you and many people of this region is to be in Hazaribagh today is to see the hill station treading between extinction and survival. So there are also the commercial interests that have come into that region, and while one can't totally dismiss them, the need for a balance. You yourself say you went to an area with a lot of mines and you drove back because you were troubled by the dust on your hands. So how, I mean, it is a necessity, and yet there is this fragile system that you worry about. So as you know, you've been seeing this region for three decades almost. He's just about in his third decade, but he's seen it since he can remember. So how do you feel about this balance between extinction and survival?
So when I write that the so-called hill station is caught up between these two extremes, either it can die or either it can survive, or it has to kind of negotiate between these two ends. It is the idea of Hazaribagh as a pastoral which is at stake. And when I say pastoral, I mean a space where people come to retreat, to reorient their thoughts, to get better, to kind of experience new things which are not available in proper urban spaces. Pastoral is also a kind of harmonious middle ground between wild nature on one hand and the civilization, ultra-civilized spaces on the other. A perfect example of a pastoral is a garden where the wild has been carefully, sympathetically ordered through human agency in order to evoke beauty. Hazaribagh is proverbially the land of 1,000 gardens, right? So when increasingly, instead of the scent of flowers, what you get is coal dust sticking on your skin, then you are forced to wonder that how long is this imagination of Hazaribagh, the pastoral imagination of Hazaribagh, going to last? I'm an optimist, so I do think that it is going to last. And what we end up doing here is a kind of double-edged sword. Ranchi at one point was also a pastoral space before it became the capital city, and now it is a city. But for people living in Ranchi, they have now figured out other pastorals. So now Horhap has become the pastoral of Ranchi, or some waterfalls have become pastorals of Ranchi. Similarly, Hazaribagh, as increasingly it transforms itself into a city space, newer pastoral satellite suburbs of sorts have emerged. Because just like I mentioned before, that we have that innate desire to be in contact with nature. Now, on one hand, this pastoralization of outer neighborhoods of Hazaribagh, even though it's creating beautiful spots, but those beautiful spots are also being put into danger due to human encroachment. As long as beauty is concerned, then one can find beauty everywhere. But what I am more concerned about is how ethical is this running after beauty, which I think I can be made a party to as well. That Mihir, you are also doing the same thing. And there can be no clear answer to that. The balance which you mention, it's a very fraught terrain. On one side, there is the necessity amongst us to be at peace in our natural surroundings. On the other side, there is necessity among us to have money. And caught up between these two poles are places like Hazaribagh, which have had their time as pastoral and are now approaching the end. Ranchi has approached its end. New pastorals are emerging in Netarhat, Saranda, all these places. So it would be interesting to see that what their trajectories are going to be like.
Now, while you were making these travels, right at the start of the book, you say you like the place, but you're not so concerned with the people. But I don't know whether you do it unconsciously or maybe there's a bit of writerly slate of hand in it. But you keep meeting people who completely change your experience of the place. There's an axeman, then there's a Oraon, Shuchar Oraon, then there is another person the tiger, the boy called Tiger. So they all come at different points when you're lost in the forest and bail you out. And in many ways, they are bailing you out, but you are also taking them to a part of their neighborhood which they knew exists, but they never saw as a place of interest.
Yes.
So this interaction was very disarming whenever it comes up in the book. So could you talk us through that?
One of the criticisms that the book often gets is कि इसमें लोग नहीं हैं. Is that Mihir, you are not talking about हजारीबाग की तंग गलियां और छोले और समोसे कहाँ मिलते हैं और इस टाइप का, that small town nostalgia. So people who want to read tales of Hazaribagh thinking कि हाँ इसमें nostalgic tales होंगे, then they are of course disappointed because these are different kinds of tales. And that's one of the very major criticisms that I get कि इसमें वो नहीं है जो कि मैं चाह रहा था. But just like you mentioned, it's not bereft of humans. It has human beings, but those human beings are not merely, they don't act as condiments. They have very specific functions to fulfill in the book. If it wasn't for Shukkarodam, we wouldn't have reached the waterfall which appears in this south chapter, in chapter 6. If it weren't for the boy tiger, I wouldn't have reached Gitti Kocha. If it weren't for Axeman, I wouldn't have been to Nisan Lagwa. And going to Nisan Lagwa also kind of undoes many, many myths. So whether Nisan Lagwa is a waterfall or whether it is a hill, what were the stories of those colorful stones? So people appear at strategic places and in strategic time, but these people have much of an agency. They are not crowd. So I was against crowd. I didn't want to include people just for the heck of it. That yes, it's a small town narrative. तो यहाँ पर शर्मा जी हैं, वहाँ पर वर्मा जी हैं, यहाँ पर गुप्ता जी हैं. उनकी कोई ज़रूरत नहीं थी. जिनकी ज़रूरत थी, they were the axeman, Shukkarodam, Gitti Kocha wala tiger, Bulu Imam Sahab, who has been such instrumental. Yes. My friend Raza is sitting there. He's the current NIF fellow. And
he's not very punctual, but he's here for the...
So Raza is there. Raza and I, we almost consider Bulu uncle our grandfather. तो जिन लोगों को होना है वो लोग हैं जिनके द्वारा एक कहानी अच्छी बनती है, वही उन्हीं लोगों को रखा गया है, but the crowd has been done away with.
So I was coming to the influence of Bulu Imam and a couple of others who were there who you read rather than met, like Shahi, the forest department official, whose work you've mentioned. His name is
SP Shahi, yes.
SP Shahi. So, and of course Bulu Imam. How does, very often he says that was there and then it's not there anymore, or don't go there, it's absolutely changed and you won't like it. So this whole trajectory of people, he's not a nostalgist, he's just somebody who's seen the place when it was untouched. And now you're seeing it in a different way. Do you feel concerned that in 3 decades you will be someone's Bulu Imam saying, don't go there, that river is dead?
It might be, and I hope that that day doesn't come.
And what was his influence in this whole book? It seems quite significant.
Yes. In the desert of no material, that when we are struggling to find some source or some writing or some essay on Chota Nagpur, there appear like a few people like Mr. Imam, Mr. Subhashis Das, who are so passionate about the land, that who become institutions in themselves, who are living libraries of information. So for me, Mr. Imam was and continues to be one such person who has not only kind of he would direct me to places where I can go. Once he got to know that what my orientation was like, how I used to think, then he himself would say कि अच्छा मिहिर आप थोड़ा उधर चले जाइए, उस गांव को देख लीजिए, वहाँ पर आपको अच्छा लगेगा. And I would ask कि आप कब गए थे? तो 20 साल पहले गए थे, 30 साल पहले गए थे, something like that. But he still remembers all the proper nouns. So he would say कि यहाँ से जाइएगा, फिर ये वाला सड़क लीजिएगा, फिर वो वाला सड़क लीजिएगा, आ जाएगा. इस उड़ाव जी का घर आएगा, उस मुंडा जी का घर आएगा. So he knows pretty much everything. So just talking to him is like being exposed to a new kind of Hazaribagh, which perhaps the book also tries to do. That it wants to present a new kind of Hazaribagh which wasn't there before, or which wasn't articulated before. And Imam Saab has been pretty much the same kind of force, and so has Mr. Subhashis Das, the megalithic researcher, who has informed so much of my appreciation for Hazaribagh's cultural heritage. Uh, it's the Isko rock art site, 9500 BC. The megalithic complexes, 1500 BC. The ruins of, Badam Fort to 1600s AD. There's a chronology which can be drawn. People say that small towns are ahistorical, that nothing happens, that history eludes small towns. Everything remains stationary, everything appears the same. But just by constructing a chronology from 10,000 BC up to the present, we find that the land of Hazaribagh has changed so much. And this challenge or this charge that is leveled against small towns, that they appear to be timeless places or ahistorical places, this charge doesn't really hold once you begin exploring. And Mr. Imam and Mr. Das were very instrumental in creating space for me to do my exploration. Yes.
Now, on to the more personal part of the book, which is your journey. So you were this young ad man in Delhi, and you suddenly decided this is not for you. And there's a part in which you say that when you're in Delhi, you're always a Jharkhand boy who's in Delhi. And when you're in Hazaribagh, you're always that guy from Delhi who's just come home. This is what your entire generation and generation upon generation from places like Hazaribagh face, this dual kind of identity. And do you think a couple of generations, in some way, I'm not saying it as an accusation, or maybe I am, left these smaller towns and somehow left them to fend for themselves, which is why there is not enough interest, there is not enough writing, there's not enough knowledge or information in a time when information abounds all over media. There's not enough being done. So do you think your generation, earlier in the day Javed Sab said yours is the generation that will in many ways right the wrongs of the last few decades. So do you feel that this dual identity of yours will help in trying to showcase some of the gems of this landscape?
I think it does help that you have some exposure of the outside world, because it creates multiple avenues in order to speak about your homeland. So right before I came here, I was in Bangalore. Before I was in Bangalore, I was doing some talks in Delhi, and these things wouldn't have happened if I weren't educated at Delhi University, or being a part of that educational space. Certainly, it helps in some ways. But it also creates a very disturbing sort of alienation from both Delhi and Hazaribagh. So I can never be a true blue Delhi wala when I am in Delhi, because वहाँ पर फिर ये हम ऐसा करेंगे और हम यहाँ जा रहे हैं, this boli comes out, which betrays me as a Jharkhandi. And when I come to Jharkhand, then just the way I speak, which I think has acquired some sort of nuance from my time in Delhi, it also separates me. कि नहीं, तुम तो यहाँ के वैसे नहीं लगते होगे, लेकिन corrupt हो गया तुम्हारा बिहारी लहजा. So that sense of alienation is always there. But I think a friend of mine told me लगभग 1 साल पहले कि मिहिर, जिनको रहना होता है वो रह जाते हैं. And of course he said this in the context of human relationships. But I can also, I would love to extend this advice in terms of a relationship of human with the non-human. कि जिनको रहना होता है वो किसी ना किसी वे में आकर वो रह जाते हैं, and they keep dwelling. So if thousands of people have left Hazaribagh in order to pursue their dreams elsewhere, then there is one Mihir who has come back. And I hope that there will be multiple such people, not multiple Mihirs, but multiple Adityas and multiple Sonals and other Akritis who would return to their homeland. Not because कि यहाँ पर मेरा जन्म हुआ तो I feel sentimental about it. Of course, that could be one driver. But also because the homeland has its merits. So the merits which one seeks elsewhere, perhaps such merits or different kinds of merits can be sought in the homeland. So maybe Delhi में ad agency थी, हजारीबाग में नहीं है, but Delhi में waterfalls नहीं थे, so हजारीबाग में है. तो इस merits को अगर ध्यान में रख कर if someone returns home, and I also think that it's kind of a responsibility for us people to return home, because if all of us go elsewhere, then तो फिर we can't be in that position to bemoan कि नहीं ये पिछड़ा जगह है. पिछड़ा जगह है तो आप क्या किए? You could have come. There are multiple IAS officers who are posted in the most backwards of districts, but you don't see them complaining. It's their duty. So I think there's that element of duty has to be there in whatever way it channels out. But that I feel that this duality of urban and provincial, it gives us that agency to fit in anywhere.
Wonderful. So before I throw it open to the audience, there's one, you do a bit of a Ruskin bond on us about this incident which you don't remember because you were sleeping and your mother has, has this slightly otherworldly experience in an auto rickshaw.
Yeah, in a cycle rickshaw, actually.
Cycle rickshaw, okay. Which was kind of flying over the bumpy roads. And the auto rickshaw driver then says something which I don't want to reveal, which proves that he's from another time. So, there's always this feeling when you talk about places like Dehradun, Mussoorie, Hazaribagh, that it has this otherworldly quality about it. So have you ever thought of writing something which explores that, that otherworldly, what is not quite there and yet is there?
So let me just clear the confusion. It's a ghost story, and it appears in the chapter titled Lake. And when people say that log nahi hai, I say कि भूत है. ठीक है, ये लोग तो हैं ही, भूत भी है. So there's a democratic representation of all denizens of Hazaribagh in the book. So and yes, I do think that there is this cultural pedagogy, cultural mode of thought which tells that in hill stations there has to be ghosts, or in hill stations there has to be suicide points. Just like there is a suicide point in Netherhut, Magnolia Point, where lovers were killed because they jumped off the cliff. So there are certain tropes which align very closely with the spaces of hill stations or any romantic construction of the place, whether it is a hill station or not, or whether it is just a plateau town. And I am a scholar of spaces, so I love to look at these phenomena, that how they come about. What happened with Mate, of course, she had an encounter with a ghost, but even the ghost is a historical ghost. The ghost he's rooted in a specific time, the freedom movement, And the residence that he was pointing at, that is also a historical building. So it makes sense on one level, but of course, being otherworldly, as you mentioned, it would be fascinating. There is a ghost in Hazaribagh. I think in Ranchi also there would be such ghosts जो कि रास्ते में खैनी मांगते हैं कि हाँ हाँ. I'm not sure if you have had heard of such ghosts or not, but हजारीबाग में there are these kinds of ghosts जो कि ऐसे अगर आप जा रहे हो शहर से अपने गांव, तो रास्ते में वो आपको रोक कर एक खैनिया देना रे, खैनिया दे, खैनिया है, so they ask for खैनी. So so there are multiple kinds of these ghosts which would be like fascinating to know more and write about. So certainly yes.
Well, right now Mihir is on a PhD, so his otherworldly experiences are him trying to find a genie to help him, I guess. I'm now happy to throw this open for questions. There's one gentleman, right?
तोहर से कहा हियो कि हिया नैनो नैनीताल है नेतरहाट में, तो अपने हिया रहा ये थी में हजारीबाग में, तो एगो इसने ट्रैवलॉग लिखले बड़ा अच्छा होता लो.
किसके ऊपर? नैनीताल
खोटा भाषा में लिखले बड़ा अच्छा होता लो कि जे एंडेंजर्ड लैंग्वेजेज हथी, जे हथी मने रीजनल लैंग्वेजेस से सेकरो विकास होते भविष्य में से ले कहे लगल हियो.
खोटा मेरी सर अच्छी नहीं है, लेकिन हम समझ पा रहे हैं आप जो कह रहे हैं.
अच्छा,
तो
देन हिंदी में आप कर सकते हैं सर?
हिंदी में बिल्कुल हम करना चाहेंगे,
क्योंकि हाँ
कि
और इसको नैनो नैनीताल का एक शीर्षक दे के आगे बढ़ाइएगा. ये मेरा रिक्वेस्ट है. थैंक यू.
एकदम इसके ऊपर विचार किया जाएगा जरूर. थैंक यू.
There's a gentleman here.
सर, आप हजारीबाग की बात कर रहे हैं, बट टुडे वी आर टॉकिंग ऑफ ग्लोबल सिटीजन्स, तो कैसे बैलेंस आप देखते हैं? हजारीबाग का क्या मतलब है आपके लिए? क्योंकि जब हम बड़े हो रहे हैं, छोटे हो रहे हैं, हर समय वी आर ट्राइंग टू फाइंड आवर आइडेंटिटी. कभी आपको लगता है कि यू आर नॉट एबल टू रिलेट टू द जेंडर, या किसी कास्ट पे, या फाइनेंशियल, या हर जगह आपको एक्सेस भी नहीं होता. तो वो आप कैसे देखते हैं हजारीबाग को? फिर ये जब हम ग्लोबल सिटीजन की बात करते हैं, अपने आप को एक्सपैंड करने की बात करते हैं, तो ये क्या मतलब, कैसे बैलेंस आप देखते हैं उसको?
देखिए, इस किताब का जो नैरेटिव स्ट्रक्चर है, इट स्टार्ट्स विथ मेंटल हेल्थ का एक एपिसोड एंड इट एंड्स विथ रेजोल्यूशन ऑफ दैट एपिसोड, और उस बीच में देयर इज एक्सप्लोरेशन, एंड द एक्सप्लोरेशन इज डन प्योरली ऑफ द लैंडस्केप व्हिच इज द लैंड इटसेल्फ, ऑफ जियोग्राफी. मेरे लिए सर हजारीबाग इज नॉट द प्लेस जहाँ पर पुरानी यादें या फिर दोस्त और घर वाली यादें हैं. मेरे लिए हजारीबाग इज दैट ग्राउंडिंग स्पेस which offered me shelter when I was trying to be a global citizen. So जब उस that global citizen के जो discourse है, उससे the kinds of rootlessness which emerge, and of course it's nice to be at multiple places, and it's nice to inhabit those multiple places, whether it's Paris, London, Hazaribagh, Delhi, IIT Delhi where I study. But there is always something which is required to ground you in literal level, and that grounding was offered by Hazaribagh. And यहाँ पर choice exercise करनी होती है सर, कि क्या हम चाहते हैं कि हजारीबाग मुझे वो grounding दे, या हम नहीं चाहते. मैं चाहता था, इसलिए the land became such. बहुत सारे लोग नहीं चाहते हैं, they are happy to be groundless because it gives them freedom. So while that freedom is very nice, and I also enjoy such freedom, but when it comes to being kind of concentrating where my roots are, तो कहने को तो मैं मिथिला का ब्राह्मण हूँ, so मिथिला में roots हैं, हमारा गांव वहाँ पर है, but my दादी चाचा they all know कि I don't identify as a मिथिला का person, I identify as very firebrand हजारीबाग का बंदा. क्योंकि मिथिला की जो वो चिकनी मिट्टी है या फिर वो जो कीचड़ है उससे मेरा सेंटी कनेक्शन नहीं है. बट जो हजारीबाग की जो लाल मिट्टी है, इवन दो इट्स नॉट फर्टाइल, इट्स नॉट गंगेटिक प्लेन्स वाला एलुवियम, बट स्टिल आई अटैच सो मच इम्पोर्टेंस टू दैट. मेरे सामने सियार भाग के जाते थे और अभी भी कभी कभार कन्हरी के जंगल में दिख जाते हैं. तो ये सारे जो इमेजेस हैं, जो विजुअल्स हैं, द काइंड्स ऑफ साउंडस्केप दैट आई ग्रू अप विथ, लास्ट में जाकर these sets of sensory remembrances, they become your grounding point, and I wanted them to become my ground. So Hazaribagh became that ground for me. So that's how I navigate between being an English speaking global citizen who can be comfortable anywhere he goes, and at the same time I can be comfortable, if not among the people of Hazaribagh, but at least in the landscape of Hazaribagh, which I call my home. So that's it.
I think we have time for one more question. Otherwise, I'm going to put your friend in the hotspot. Acha, he's been saved by someone.
I'm asking you just one question. We have now Ranchi Hazaribagh Railway. Earlier we had North Kanpura project. How do you take them? How have they impacted Hazaribagh as a landscape, as a natural beauty? If you had a chance, would you undo them?
Yes, I would. I would. I would. So, there's no doubt about it. Like because my fidelity is with Hazaribagh's natural landscape. So anything that comes in that way, personally, I would be against it. बट मेरे होने ना होने से कुछ होता नहीं है. जो होता है वो तो हम भी देखें, आप भी देखें. रही बात कि हजारीबाग का रेलवे लाइन, आज तक अभी कोई एक्सप्रेस ट्रेन थोड़ी ना चल रही है. वो मालवाहक ट्रेन ही चल रही हैं जो वहाँ से कोयला उठा कर ले जाती हैं. सो द रेटोरिक दैट हजारीबाग नाउ हैज़ अ रेलवे लाइन एंड अ स्टेशन, it's empty words, because no train goes from Hazaribagh to Delhi. एक कभी सप्ताह में 3 या 4 दिन एक स्पेशल ट्रेन चलती है, रांची से पटना जाती है. वो हजारीबाग रात के 2 बजे पहुंचती है. वो भूत ही उठाते हैं वहां से. तो इंसान तो नहीं उठाते. देयर इज वन पैसेंजर ट्रेन विच रन्स फ्रॉम कोडरमा टू बड़का काना. उस पर एक बार मन किया था कि बैठ के देखते हैं कैसा लगता है. तो बैठ गए. वो कुज्जू के माइंस को होते हुए लेकर गई. थोड़ा सा अच्छा अच्छा जंगल दिखा. बट द मोर सच, यही परेशानी यही हो जाती है कि देर इज इन द यूएस ट्रेडिशन, देर इज अ बुक कॉल्ड मशीन इन द गार्डन. इट्स बाय लियो मार्क्स, एंड he analyzes some literature, and he says कि in American tradition, the idea of this pastoral, of this harmony between natural space and the civilization space, यूएस में यह है कि देर इज एक गार्डन एग्जिस्ट कर रहा है, उसके अंदर एक मशीन आ गया तो वो इंटरप्ट हो जाता है. झारखंड के साथ थोड़ा सा सिचुएशन अलग है. झारखंड में गार्डन्स कंस्ट्रक्ट होने मशीन के थ्रू ही हुए थे. सो द मोर पीपल, एंड हिस्टोरिकली फ्रॉम colonial times, since colonial times, that the more people were engaged in land and accessing its potential in terms of extraction, कि कौन से मिनरल कहाँ से निकाल सकते हैं, जितना वो अंदर आए उतना उनको अच्छा लगा. So at the same time there is pastoralization happening, and at the also simultaneously there is extraction happening. तो उसके बीच का भी तालमेल बिठाना अभी के समय में, it has become very fragile. तो any encroachment into natural area, वो I shudder when I come across these examples. या in terms of industrialization, in terms of even beautification, कि वो एक बहुत सीमित ऐसे जगह हैं जो कि बचे हुए हैं. और अगर उसके अंदर भी अगर हम लोग चले गए, एंड इफ वी टेक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इनसाइड दैट, तो देन इट्स अ काइंड ऑफ अ डेथ नेल. हमने कंडेम कर दिया उसको कि अब खत्म हो गया. सो दैट्स हाउ आई टेक अ वेरी काइंड ऑफ अ सैड नोट हियर, but I'm also an optimist, so I think it's a radical choice to be an optimist in such kind of situation, कि you do kind of fall back on, or at least bank on the morality of your fellow citizens, कि अगर हम देख रहे हैं तो आपको भी कभी ना कभी ये चीज़ का एहसास होगा, and perhaps we can then stop this mindlessness. That's what I feel.
I think that's where we'll have to wind up, but may there never be enough waterfalls for you, Mihir. It has been so wonderful speaking to you. This is a book that won the Yuva Sahitya Academy Award. So I would encourage many of you to pick up the book. It's available at the bookstore, and particularly those who are from Ranchi, because sometimes, like the axeman who helped Mihir out, we don't know about the beauty that lies just next to us, and we keep looking at pictures of snow-capped mountains and golden beaches when there is a different kind of beauty. And thank you, Mihir, for
Thank you so much.
exposing that and you know, educating us about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, all of you, for coming. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you very much, sir, for answering all the questions patiently, and thank you very much, ma'am, for your time. Thank you very much. So with this, we come to the end of our session named Tales of Hazaribagh. Moving forward to our next session, the name of the session is Manu Bhandari.